Okay, I apologize because I was on the phone with Dr. Baldwin. I believe that everyone who's presenting today, I have set you as a co-host. That's what I was doing there, so that you should be able to share your screen now. I think unless someone would like to volunteer to go first, that I will just go in the order, which means first, Jacob.
Yeah, I'll go. I was going to volunteer anyhow.
All right. And then Drissel, you will be next, just so you know.
So do I just go ahead and click the share screen button?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Welcome.
I still do not have screen sharing ability.
All right, let me try again. Did that fix it?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome. Just let me know when to go.
Okay. So thank you all for getting on again and doing our virtual poster session. We did the first half of the class, the first 8 students last week, and we're going to do 9 this week. So the format will be very similar in that I'm hoping to keep each student around 5 minutes. So if you talk for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll take a question or two. And we actually found maybe the chat box works the best for questions. And if we start running behind, we'll hold the questions to the end. But it's great if every presenter can get at least 1 or 2 questions or feedback from their peers or any other faculty who might be on the meeting right now. I appreciate you guys coming. I'm glad we could still make this happen. I think although the posters are a little small in this format, I think it's really good and that each of you get a few minutes of individual time to talk about what you're doing. I won't waste any more time. I'll let Jacob go. If there are any questions, you can type them in the chat box and it doesn't really interrupt anybody as they're talking. So you may go, Jacob.
Awesome, great. So this project really revolves around longleaf pine understory restoration in the South Carolina sandhills. Specifically, we're looking at how harvesting operations really affect plant establishment in the absence of wiregrass. So a lot of people are familiar with longleaf pine ecosystems. They're extremely diverse and very valuable as far as their ecology is concerned. I have some stats there, but we're pretty much all aware of the ecological value associated with longleaf pine ecosystems. However, most of the research that's been done, it really revolves around longleaf pine ecosystems with a wiregrass understory. This project is relatively unique in the fact that we're in the wiregrass gap in South Carolina. I think Ellie talked about it a little bit last week. So there's no wiregrass present, and we really get an opportunity to see what the ecology is and how things interact and respond given the absence of that wiregrass. So a couple of objectives for this project. The first being we want to determine the effects of 3 different harvesting operations on, I guess, subsurface moisture availability as well as subsequent, I guess, restoration success along a moisture gradient. So basically what that means is we're going to look at 3 different harvesting methods and figure out which, I guess, post-harvest ground condition is going to be most successful in terms of understory restoration, and that's on sites that are mesic and xeric, or at least along that gradient. In addition to this, we also want to apply a landscape ecosystem classification system, which is a mouthful, that's specific for the sandhills region, I guess all across the wiregrass gap, to be able to, like, I guess, restore certain areas, or at least map out certain areas that should be restored. For my particular site, it's part of the Margaret Lloyd Endowment that was given to Clemson here a couple years ago. The location is called Hardscramble. It's roughly 754 acres in Kershaw County in Camden, South Carolina. It's been largely unmanaged for 50 years. And in my specific study site, it's about 88 acres and it's largely loblolly dominant. So we're really converting loblolly to longleaf. And my particular project is looking at the understory restoration effects, I guess. So my project, we want to implement a randomized block design where we have 4 blocks, each 20 to 28 acres. And we're going to place them along a soil moisture gradient ranging from mesic to xeric. Within each of those blocks, we'll split it into 3 treatment zones, each, I think, like 6 to 8 acres. The 3 treatments will be a biomass harvest, which will be represented by, I guess, bare ground, we're going to use I guess a regular harvest is our control, which will leave a significant amount of slab ground. And then finally, we're going to have a mulching operation where we'll have a significant amount of mulch on the ground. And those will be our 3 treatments. And those will be replicated in each of the 4 blocks. And then following the harvest, we'll have, I think, 4 to 5 plots in each of the treatment zones, giving us 48 to 60 plots overall. And they'll be 10 by 10, I guess 10 feet by 10 feet. We'll either seed using a store-bought premix or undeveloped seed mix. We might actually use part of Ellie's project for that. And then we want to actually monitor soil moisture using a series of tensiometers, and then the following field season conduct a Carolina vegetation survey and basically see what our success is, or if we have any success. And so the theory behind all of this is that in the sandhills, subsurface moisture availability is probably the limiting factor regarding understory plant establishment. If you think about the sandhills and I guess the soil composition, they're extremely well drained, very dry. And if you think about the establishment of a seed, you're really looking at the moisture availability within maybe that first centimeter. And so harvesting methods that really result in, I guess, better moisture retention should probably give us better understory restoration success. And of our 3 treatments, we think that a mulching operation will probably give us our best, or I guess our most moisture retention, and will probably yield like the best success. Versus maybe a biomass harvest, which doesn't have that thin layer of organic material and doesn't allow that, I guess, moisture retention, increased moisture retention. Additionally, we also think that if there are any harvesting methods that result in increased moisture retention, they'll probably be more significant in xeric areas compared to mesic areas because those areas are obviously drier, so any increase in moisture availability will probably be more significant. If there are any questions, that's pretty much all I have. We haven't really done anything as far as field work is concerned yet, so.
You may unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question, or type one in.
How the heck do I get off of this?
Escape, and then I could stop participant sharing. There you go.
That's so much better.
Did it for you.
Thank you.
Does anyone have a question for Jacob before we move to Jercel?
I'm here.
Okay. If anyone thinks of anything, please type it in the chat box and we will go over those questions at the end. After Jercel is Manisha, just so you know. Okay, that's perfect.
Okay, can I start? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
My presentation is about changes in land cover tips for Pickens County between 2001 and 2016. And there are 15 land cover tips in this area. And you know that global climate and land use change, population dynamics, and changes in water availability create challenges between human activity and ecosystems. And human activity affects land cover change, and land cover change affects ecosystems, and then ecosystems affect human activity again. Here is my study area in Pickens County. It has been South Carolina, and classified land cover data for 2001 and 2016 formed from MRLC. And here is definition about the land cover tips. I studied on land cover tips in ArcMap, ArcGIS. Here is land cover tips for 2000 and 2016. Actually, there are mostly forest and then water. To see the difference is too difficult. That's why I calculated the value about the land cover tips. Actually, when we look at the ecosystem service providers, that is decreasing about 2%, And when we look at the ecosystem service beneficiaries, it is increasing about 7%. It means that inside this forest and in other tips is increasing, and beneficiaries is increasing. And we can get the pie chart. Here is forest, and here is eco-service beneficiaries. Here is 2001, and here 2000, and it has some results. Decrease in ecosystem service providers and an increase in ecosystem service beneficiaries between 2001 and 2016. Yeah, thanks so much for listening to me. By the way, I have some problem connection. That's why the voice is not clear. If you have any questions, write on the chat. It will be useful for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Drissel. And as he said, if you have a question, type it in the chat box. And
yeah, please.
And we will answer that at the end. If you type it to everyone, or you can type it to the individual. For now, Manisha, we'll go to you, and then Mike, you are after Manisha.
Yeah, is that okay? Excuse me.
Yes, that's good. Yes.
Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Manisha Parazuli. The topic of my research is an assessment of fuel consumption by harvesting equipment. I would like to welcome everyone to my poster presentation, and here is what I'm going to study. I would like to begin with the type of harvesting system used in the United States. There are mainly three types of harvesting system. There are whole tree harvesting, quarter-length harvesting, and tree-length harvesting. However, we are only focusing on whole tree harvesting system. United States is one of the world's largest producer, importer, and exporter of the wood product. As a result, timber harvesting equipment has undergone major development in the past few decades, including improvement in the fuel efficiency. The fuel consumption of harvesting equipment varies across the type of the equipment used. In the southern US, past studies indicate that on an average, the fuel cost contribute to 18.5% of the total harvesting cost. Fuel consumption is affected by many factors, and some of them are silviculture treatment, harvesting intensity, and site condition. Wood pellet market and bioenergy market has been a recent development in South Carolina, and which are very much interested in low value product, and also they are interested to determine the fuel consumption and associated cost of the harvesting. Here is the picture of what is stand before harvesting and stand during the harvesting operation. The main objective of our research is to determine the fuel consumption of each harvesting equipment, as well as we are also going to understand the effect of stand condition and silviculture treatment on fuel consumption. Similarly, we also aim to compare the fuel consumption between roundwood harvesting and biomass harvesting. Here are some pictures of harvesting equipment mostly used in the South Carolina. The first is feller buncher, that is used to cut the trees. Grapple skidder is used to collect the bunch of the harvested wood and carry it to the landing area. Loader and delimber are used to separate the branches from the stem and load into the truck for the transportation. In-wood chipper means the mobile chipper, which can go to the landing area and then convert the harvested wood into the chips. As I already mentioned that there are so many factors that affect fuel consumption. In the chart, I have shown that fuel consumption is mainly affected by stand condition, silviculture treatment, harvesting process, and it also depends upon loggers. We are going to conduct our study in Piedmont region of the South Carolina, which is highlighted by the green color in the map. As a method of the data collection, we will collect the data of the stand, like stand density, basal area, height, and reviews. Here is the picture of the inline fuel meter, which will be installed at the logger fuel tank, so that we can calculate the total amount of fuel consumed by each harvesting equipment. Unfortunately, I don't have any result to present because the research has not been started yet due to the bad weather condition in early spring and due to various things in the later spring. However, I have mentioned some of the expected results and its use. We can estimate fuel consumption per unit of wood produced. Similarly, we can also determine the total fuel cost during the harvesting operation. The information from the research can be very useful for the landowners who want to compare the effectiveness of different silviculture treatment. Most importantly, we can also determine carbon emission from different stand conditions, and we can evaluate the environmental impact associated with each cost. Last but not the least, I would like to thank everyone who are directly and indirectly connected with my research and has contributed in my research. Thank you. If anybody has any question, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Manisha?
Yeah, I got one. Great presentation, Manisha. I'm kind of curious to see how exactly stand density affects fuel consumptions. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Fuel is that stand density and fuel consumption you asked?
Yes.
The relation? Yeah. When the density of the stand is high, there will be more number of trees in the stand, which means the felling machine no need to travel more distance in order to reach the another tree to harvest. This means it has to travel only few distance, which will minimize the fuel consumption. Yeah, if the stand density is high, the fuel consumption will be low. Yeah, did I answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have another question, Manisha, from Lily in the chat box.
Okay.
As well. It says, do some harvesting methods take longer per amount of wood than others, or are they similar? Maybe methods that take longer have higher fuel consumption.
Sorry, where is the chat box?
So the very bottom Zoom window, not necessarily the one you're sharing. There's like a little chat bubble.
I can't see the chat. Can you repeat
Okay,
the
I
question?
can read it again.
Yeah.
Do some of the harvesting methods take longer per amount of wood than others, or are they all similar? Maybe methods that take longer have higher fuel consumption?
Methods, harvesting methods, and time of harvesting?
Yes.
Yeah, it all depends upon the types of the harvesting equipment used and type of the stand. There are many factors which affect the time of the harvesting. Yeah, we are going to conduct our research and focus only on the whole tree harvesting system. That's why it depends from the cut to length harvesting systems and the tree length harvesting system. Actually, yeah, it differs from one system to another.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manisha. We'll move on.
Yeah.
Lily says thanks as well. We will move on to Mike, and then Al, you are next.
Okay. All right, so I'm presenting a project. It's called The Effects of Management on Early Successional Avian Species in South Carolina. So basically an early successional habitat is a forest that's regenerating after a disturbance like a fire or timber harvest. In South Carolina, these habitats have been declining over the past 70 years. And that's a problem for a suite of species, but the two I'm focusing on are ruffed grouse and golden winged warblers. Both species exist at the edge of the range in South Carolina. They would be confined to the Blue Ridge region. Ruffed grouse are declining throughout the eastern range and have been put on the endangered species list for a couple states only in the past year. And golden winged warblers are proposed to be listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So knowing where and how they're using habitat in South Carolina will help managers prepare for potential listing. So a few objectives of my study are to determine the distribution of ruffed grouse and golden winged warblers in South Carolina. With that, we want to understand how management of early successional forest influences the presence and absence of golden winged warblers and ruffed grouse, specifically controlled fires and timber harvest. And then the last thing we want to figure out is how autonomous recording units can be used to detect and monitor both species. So we're going to do this through point count surveys primarily. They're going to be conducted throughout the Blue Ridge of South Carolina on public lands. They're going to be conducted in a conditional occupancy modeling framework. Standard occupancy modeling involves about 3 surveys per site. Conditional occupancy is different. It's catered towards more rare species. What I'm doing is I'm surveying each site I have once, and then only resurveying sites with positive detection. This will allow me to extrapolate a detection probability throughout all sites, as well as an occupancy probability. My survey sites are categorized by management type. So we're looking at thinning, clear cuts, and controlled burns, and even wildfires. ARUs are placed at sites with positive and without positive detection, and point count surveys are conducted with ARU recordings to determine the efficiency of both survey methods. So the implications of this project are wide and varied. Primarily, like I said before, it's going to give South Carolina a better understanding of how healthy their early successional habitats are and the species who depend on them. Ruffed grouse, like I said, are an important game species. They contribute to the hunting economy in South Carolina, so it's important for managers to know where they are, if they are here. Golden winged warblers, like I said, their population is declining throughout their range, so it's extremely important that we know where they are. Other species like prairie warblers, blue-winged warblers of both we're looking at as well. And northern bobwhite, eastern towhee, and indigo buntings, they all depend on early successional habitats. And we want to know how we can fit all these species into a management plan for South Carolina. That's basically what I'm working on. It started this January. I'm in the field right now, and it'll go on for the next 2 years. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Mike. We have one question already from Calvin. Any chance of using citizen science for detection?
Yeah, so citizen science would be great. South Carolina DNR, they're actually currently using an ArcGIS platform for citizens to report any kind of ruffed grouse sighting. They kind of just punch in the coordinates and punch in any notes. So they've been working with that. Unfortunately, this kind of project started in the COVID-19 era, so I haven't been able to explore many options other than myself to collect data. For example, we were supposed to have a technician on this season, and obviously that didn't work out. I think citizen science could be great for this project, though, because these species could be anywhere in that Blue Ridge region, so having more than one person looking at it would be great.
Anyone else have a question for Mike? Oh, Colby has typed in another one. What sort of challenges do you anticipate encountering or detecting ruffled grouse? Do you have any leads from South Carolina DNR, grouse hunters, or anywhere else? In my hunting experience, it's very difficult to encounter.
Yeah, so I'll start with the leads. So there are grouse in South Carolina. There definitely are. I've gotten pictures from game wardens and biologists that have encountered them on logging roads, old logging roads in the past couple months. I haven't heard any yet. I think the population is probably very small. I don't think that's news to South Carolina DNR, or else they wouldn't be having this project. One of the greatest issues with detecting a species like a grouse in small population numbers is that only the males drum. So they hop up on a drumming log and they beat their wings really quick. It creates a miniature sonic boom, actually, and that's what I'm listening to, the drumming of the male grouse trying to attract females. So if you take that already small population and divide it by two, that's the amount of individuals I'm listening for. They're often in rugged habitat as well as bordering early successional habitat. So places like Jocassee Gorges, which is notoriously difficult to hike around. That limits the amount of area I can cover personally. So that's the main problems with detecting grouse. On the other hand, golden wing warblers will be much easier to detect per individual. Their habitat shouldn't be as brutal to get into, and the males readily display themselves through their singing. They establish territories, and they just hop up on a tree and sing all day long. So if they're there, I should be able to hear them.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I think we will move on now, but if you have more questions for Mike, you can type them in the chat box and we'll catch up at the end.
Thanks, guys.
Luau, are you able to share your screen?
Yeah. Hmm?
Okay, that looks
Okay. So hello everyone, I'm Lu Yao. I work with Dr. Mihalova and I made this poster for my GS project this semester. And the objective of the study was to map typical associations between soil odors and land use in Oconee County in South Carolina. And overall, there are 3 soil odors and 15 land cover taps in Oconee County, and the forest land cover taps occupied most of the total areas in this county, and in all the land cover taps, source occupied more than 91% of each land cover area, and so an source is a highly erodible soil tap with low soil nutrient content, so which may cause unproductivity of soils in South Carolina. Soil erosion is a concern for more than 60% of Oconee County in South Carolina. So study area is in here, and I created 2 maps. It's soil odor maps and land use and land cover maps. So in land cover maps, we can see the deciduous forest, mixed forest, and evergreen forest, and high pasture account for most of the land cover taps. And in here and in soil odor maps, so all the orange portion of the this color is all the source. You can see in the Oconee County, all source occupies most of the area, and then I calculate the associations between soil odors and land cover taps. So I calculated each the percentage of each soil odors in each land cover taps, and you can see in all the land cover taps, all the sources always occupy the most of the total area for each land cover tap. So the degree of erosion affects the productivity of the soil and the potential to affect the diversity of vegetation communities, forest health, and virus management, treatment, and is important for manager to monitor land cover type. Otherwise, the environmental problems will worsen over time. And erosion control measures such as replanting of bio areas is advised, and we can plant more forests to control soil erosion, because forest plays an important role in controlling soil erosion, and trees and plants in forests can help most of the layer of soil by their roots, so they can control the soil erosion by not allow the wind and water to carry away the topmost layer of the soil easily. And so that's all my presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, you can feel free to ask. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions for Luau, you can unmute your mic or type it into the chat box. Okay, Megan, I don't think I told you, but you are up next. After Megan is Kyle, and then we'll do Andrew and Colby.
Ready? Okay. So I'm Megan, for those who don't know me. My project mostly revolves around forestry best management practices. So forestry best management practices is basically a list of rules for when a forest harvest takes place. So those rules are mostly to protect water quality, and the one that I'm focusing on, or my project is focusing on, is to the rule that you have to use some way to stabilize soil post-harvest in order to reduce or minimize erosion. So the main way we do this, mostly for cost effect purposes, is to spread out a mix of seeds, and that mix of seeds roots and protects the soil. In South Carolina, unfortunately, we haven't updated this mix of seeds in about 20 to 30 years. So we actually have 3 different invasive species on that recommended list of seeds that we use. If you look at the bottom left, there's actually a map. We realized that South Carolina might not be the only state that actually has this issue, and that's a heat map. So the darker the color, going from light pale yellow all the way to dark red, represents the number of invasive species that they use in that state published list. So if you look at it, Tennessee's really bad, and all the green states actually have 0 invasive species, which are perfect. The gray states just don't have a published list. You have to talk to someone and they'll recommend something. So for South Carolina, we decided to get ahead of this and find an alternate mix of species that we can use to stabilize the soil just as well, because we don't want to have any erosion, and also not be actively spreading invasive species across all of our forests in South Carolina. So we constructed 3 different experimental mixes. I won't go into exactly what we put into them, but none of them have any invasive species in them. Then we had a couple controls, one that was bare earth control, one was just volunteer. And then we also tested that against the recommended seed mixes that South Carolina uses across the state. So I'm not going to go into exactly how well everything worked, like statistics wise, because I don't have enough time. But luckily for us, we did find that our mixes stabilize the soil just as well as the recommended species without using any invasives. Yay for us. Unfortunately, the way that we did this, all of the mixes didn't have as well as, didn't stabilize as well as we expected overall, mostly because we weren't able to use other stabilization methods such as straw, yada, yada. So we would actually have a follow-up mini study with a rainfall simulator study to see seed mobility, but we haven't actually finished that. I'm still working on that. But that's the general overview of what's going on. And if you are going to be staying in South Carolina, look for new BMP manuals right now. I don't know how the COVID stuff is working out, but we should be having new seed mixes and new updated BMP manuals in the next couple years. That's most of what we're working on. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute and shoot me a question, or I can check the chat box if there's anything chat related on there. Is that a no questions?
If anyone thinks of a question for Megan, if they'll type it in the chat box and she'll be able to answer it at the end. Kyle, you are up.
Alrighty. How's that look?
That's good.
Good? Okay.
You
All right.
might
Hey,
zoom in
everybody.
just a little,
So
but-
this talk is, oops, let me go here. All right. So this talk's focused on metric discord and looking at the effects of metric discord on the prioritization of freshwater conservation efforts. When I talk about metric discord, I'm really just talking about different ways of quantifying biodiversity, right? So biodiversity is kind of this very dynamic thing. It's hard to kind of pinpoint it. So we can talk about, you know, biodiversity is a number of species in an area. It can be kind of this multi-metric component that confers an aspect of biotic integrity, or it can be kind of this multivariate description that tries to get at, you know, functional diversity or even phylogenetic diversity. And so there's a lot of work that's been done that tells us that these, you know, depending on what metrics we're using, we can kind of end up with observing different patterns across the given landscape. But not a whole lot of work has been done that tells us how this metric discord can affect systematic conservation planning, right? So this is kind of like the bang for your buck as far as conservation efforts go. And so we're focusing in the Congaree Biosphere region. I did my field work last spring to last fall, actually. We sampled both macroinvertebrate and freshwater fish communities, and we calculated biotic integrity estimates, richness estimates, and then we had this Ross quadratic entropy, which is basically a proxy for functional diversity, as well as functional redundancy. We've modeled these using random forest regression trees. Basically just using, you know, Jacquard similarity matrices and different Pearson's correlation matrices. So for instance, our first result here is this was a principal coordinate analysis that took all of these metrics and it took a Jacquard similarity matrix and just tried to maximize variation, right? So all of these metrics are inherently spatial. And so what we end up seeing is that our data kind of spread along two main axes. The first axis is just a simple species richness component, and our second axis is kind of this functional diversity, functional redundancy axis. And we see quite a bit of separation based on the organism group as well, where we have kind of our invertebrate metrics up here on the top right, fish on the bottom left more so. But then if we take each individual metric and run it through this kind of cost benefit algorithm, we're seeing that this variation doesn't really affect priority networks down here on the left. So this x-axis is basically a representation of area. So how big is this network that we're trying to design? So if we're designing really small networks, metric choice doesn't seem to matter as much. But once we start getting up into the relatively larger networks, we're seeing, as we would expect, that more spatially overlapping metrics produce more similar networks. They tell us essentially the same thing. And so then to kind of tie this into more of a real world application, now that we've done kind of the exploratory analysis, we developed different scenarios, right? So this optimal scenario represents all 8 metrics simultaneously. And then the fish metric is, going to represent a data set that only has fish data or only invertebrate data. These bottom 3 scenarios are going to be like really data poor situations, right? So maybe you're in a region that doesn't have a calibrated biotic integrity formula, or you don't know what traits your species exhibit. So we analyze these different scenarios just using hierarchical clustering and MRPP analyses. And what we find is, again, so this 10% is going to be the smallest priority networks. And we find that simple richness estimates perform just as well as these complex kind of multi-metric estimates. And everything within this box is statistically similar to the kind of that optimal scenario. So we would just say that those are pretty good surrogates. But then those richness estimates really tend to fall out when we get to those larger networks. So just kind of some implications. I think if you're sampling in one of those data poor regions, you could benefit from, simple metrics, but sampling multiple organism groups. Otherwise, if you've got access to those multi-metric indices, you might as well use them to kind of promote that variability. I think that's all I've got, so happy to take any questions.
Okay, if anyone thinks of a question for Kyle, if you'll put it in the chat box, we will cover it at the end. For now, we'll move on to Andrew, and then Colby, you will be the last presenter today after him. That's good, but you're still muted.
Can y'all hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, so my project focuses on the economic values of South Carolina's coastal wetlands, specifically their ecosystem services. So for a brief introduction, South Carolina's coastal wetlands have long been known to be very economically important to the state, but there's actually little literature to suggest or prove that claim. So this study is kind of hoping to provide some background to that. So just kind of for a background on ecosystem services, there are provisioning services, cultural services, regulating services, and supporting services. And there's a few examples in that table you can see right here. The objectives of this study were to identify the ecosystem services that coastal wetlands provide, and then estimate their economic value when feasible. In order to do this, first a spatial analysis was conducted where coastal habitats within South Carolina's coastal wetlands were identified. And those habitats are actually seen over here across the top of the results table. From there, with those habitats known, we dug into the literature and used a value transfer method, which essentially takes an original dollar value estimate from a study from a like site, in my case, mostly the Southeast with similar coastal environments, and then with proper adjustments transferred to South Carolina, which is this study site. And this method can kind of be shown through this diagram here. So what the results show are, for each habitat, there is a specific ecosystem service listed. The table is fairly empty because the literature is still pretty sparse as far as what services have been valued. So as you can see, the values listed correspond with the particular habitat. And each asterisk represents a value or a service we know to have value, but just hasn't been documented in the literature, or the unit was not the same as the dollar per acre that we're looking for in a standardized unit, and so it was left off. But so with these results, you can see that even the smallest dollar value estimates, when put on a landscape scale where South Carolina has over 500,000 acres of coastal wetlands, is extremely economically important. They can't be scaled up for scaling issues, but you can tell how important these values are and how much they influence South Carolina. So while progress is being made on valuing ecosystem services, the literature is still very sparse. Hopefully in the coming years that will change. This study could improve first by having more literature to pull from, and then hopefully one day South Carolina has its own original study conducted where we can not necessarily rely on other states' studies, but have our own data. But that's what I have for now. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay, if anyone thinks of a question for Andrew, they can type it in the chat box. It looks like we will have a little time at the end because we only have one more presenter, so please think over the presentations you've watched and ask a few questions. For now, we will move on to Colby.
Okay, can you see that all right?
Yes, we can now.
Okay.
Yep, you're good.
All right, so thank you everyone for hanging around up to the end today. It's been really interesting seeing all the different types of research y'all are doing. So the title of my project that I'm presenting today is Incorporating Network Connectivity into Stream Classification Frameworks. And this is a pretty interesting exercise to put together this poster. I've presented it 5 times at conferences, but always as an oral presentation. Never as a poster, so kind of distilling it down into 1 page is an interesting exercise. So to give some background, as ecologists, we often find ourselves asking ourselves, this question: who is where and why? This is kind of the fundamental goal of city ecology as a whole, and it kind of goes without saying that understanding and predicting the spatial variation of biodiversity is really important, no matter what field of study that you're in. And so I'm dealing with streamfish here, and it's long been recognized that streamfish communities are organized by both local and regional processes. However, historically, there's been an emphasis on the local, where communities are essentially filtered out by a successive hierarchical set of landscape filters to determine the local community. So there's been a lot of focus on the local scale. However, more recently, we found that dispersal is a really prominent structuring agent in freshwater communities. And dispersal deals with movement to and from adjacent habitats. And it's been shown to have a big effect on local community composition. And dispersal is mediated by this concept of network connectivity. which in streams deals with the size and proximity of connected streams as well as their relative characteristics. And so stream classifications are a really important tool for managing aquatic resources, as they allow you to identify, or as they identify different types of streams with different communities. And there's just myriad uses for them. However, they've never considered network connectivity. They've only ever considered local habitat. So where I'm coming into this is incorporating connectivity into stream classification. So that's our purpose, and I'm really just trying to answer the question, can incorporating network connectivity improve the predictive power of stream classifications? So methods, I created a database of all South Carolina streams, weightable streams, and attributed landscape level environmental variables to every stream reach in the state. We have a list of variables indexing local factors, which are commonly used in classification. This is drainage area, temperature, slope, hydrology, channel confinement. This is kind of the contemporary approach. And then we have a suite of connectivity variables. I'm not going to go through those right now, but if anyone has any questions on them, I'll definitely answer them. And then we have our community data, which I have 447 sites across the state of South Carolina with streamfish community data to species. And we're using presence absence data here. And so what we do is we put both this environment and the community data into a conditional inference tree analysis, which I'm not going to explain, but basically it's a regression tree which implements binary splits in your predictor variables to maximize change in the response. So it's just using these landscape characteristics to identify different types of streams. And we built 3 models. One of them considered just local effects. The second considered connectivity only. And then the third was allowed to consider both local and connectivity factors. And we compared each model on their ability to describe total community variation and then individual community metrics or elements of community structure. These are like richness and abundance metrics of different taxonomic families or different functional groups, that sort of thing. So to come down to results, on the left, I just have my 3 classifications. I'd love to talk about each individually, but that's outside of the scope of this presentation. So if you remember, we have one that was just built using local factors, one that was built using just connectivity factors, and the last one which used both. And so if we look at how each classification explains the total community variation, we just have that top bar chart there. I know you can't read the axes, but basically the top 3 lines are my 3 classifications, and the rest of them are the variables, individual variables. And this is just showing how well they explain the community. And the takeaway is that each classification does pretty equally well at explaining the community. And then every classification does much better than any variable did on their own, which shows that they're efficiently integrating our environmental variables. And then just that little Venn diagram I have in the results section shows how each classification differed in their ability to describe different elements of community structure. And so I just have the metrics associated with the classification that describe them best. The idea here is that each classification had differential performance on describing these different elements of community structure. So although the overall variation is about the same, we see that each classification was good at predicting, different metrics. So just to discuss what I have here, incorporating these connectivity effects did not improve the classification's overall ability to describe streamfish occurrence. However, they performed differently in explaining different community metrics. We found that abundance metrics tended to be better explained by local factors, and richness was better explained by regional factors. And so this kind of just emphasizes the importance of the variables you choose when you're building a stream classification, and that using this kind of metric-based validation approach where you look at different aspects of the community, you can kind of see, even if every classification or you're describing everything overall equally or relatively equally, each classification is working on different elements of the community. So it's really informative. And just a novel finding was that species of conservation concern, priority species, tended to be better predicted by our connectivity classifications, which tends to suggest that the habitat connectivity might be important to the persistence of these species. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge all the SCD and R biologists who contributed to the data. I was able to trade 2 summers of fieldwork for 6 summers of data, so it was a pretty good trade on my end. And it's just been a blast working on this project. So yeah, I'd like to take any questions if you have them. And thanks again.
Okay. It looks like this is a question for you, Colby, from Andrew. No, okay. I apologize. He's answering someone's question in the chat. Does anyone have a question for Colby? I don't see any unanswered questions in the chat section. Does anyone want to unmute their mic and ask a question? Okay, well, I think we had a few more questions last week, but I think everyone this week did a great job, and we're probably getting tired here as finals approach. Everyone did a wonderful job. I appreciate everyone's flexibility in presenting their posters in this new format, which actually I think works pretty well because each student gets the floor for a few minutes or some of their own time so everybody can see. Hopefully next semester when we're back, we can have a poster session in person. Thanks to all the additional faculty and students who have signed in to watch the posters who aren't in the class. And I hope everyone has a great finals week and a great summer if we don't get to see you before then. Thank you.